Everything changed the moment the judge asked whether I intended to contest my wife's demands. The courtroom was silent enough that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner above the bench. Every face seemed turned toward me, waiting for an answer. Across the room sat my wife, Megan. She looked completely relaxed, confident, certain, the kind of confidence that only comes from believing the outcome is already decided. Her attorney had spent the last 20 minutes outlining exactly what she wanted from the divorce settlement. $8.5 million. Half of my logistics company. Our family ranch in Nebraska. The ranch bothered me most. Money can be replaced. Businesses can recover. But that land had belonged to my family for 3 generations. My grandfather built the original barn with his own hands. My father was buried beneath a cottonwood tree overlooking the north pasture. Megan knew exactly what she was asking for, and she asked for it anyway. Her attorney finished speaking and sat down. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at me. "Mr. Harrison, do you intend to contest these requests?" I slowly rose from my chair. My attorney turned toward me with a confused expression. He knew what was coming, but not everyone else did. I cleared my throat. "No, Your Honor." The courtroom froze. I agree to all of it. A wave of whispers immediately spread through the gallery. I saw Megan's eyebrows lift in surprise. Even her attorney looked stunned. For a brief moment, she smiled. She thought she had won. What nobody in that room knew was that I had brought a single folder with me that morning. And inside that folder was everything. The truth, the timeline, the evidence, and the reason I had absolutely no intention of arguing with my wife in court. Because sometimes the fastest way to expose a lie is to let the liar believe they're winning. Before that moment in the courtroom, my life had followed a rhythm so predictable that I rarely stopped to question it. I owned a logistics company based in Kansas City. 20 years earlier, I had started with 3 trucks, a rented warehouse, and more determination than money. By the time the divorce began, we operated distribution centers across 4 states and managed contracts worth tens of millions of dollars every year. Success never felt glamorous to me. Most weeks I worked 60 hours or more. My mornings started before sunrise, and many evenings ended with spreadsheets spread across my desk long after everyone else had gone home. The business demanded attention, and I gave it willingly because I believed I was building something that would outlast me. Whenever I had free time, I spent it at our family ranch in Nebraska. That place grounded me. The ranch wasn't just property. It was history. Every fence line, every pasture, every weathered building carried memories of people who had come before me. No matter how stressful business became, a weekend there always restored some sense of balance. Megan seemed to love that life. She worked in marketing and often joked that she enjoyed having a husband who preferred cattle auctions over country clubs. To anyone looking from the outside, we appeared stable, successful, comfortable. For years, I believed that image myself. Then small things began to change. Megan started asking more questions about the company. At first, the questions seemed harmless. She wanted to know how contracts worked, how ownership shares were structured, how business valuations were calculated. I welcomed the interest. After all, married couples discuss finances. But the questions became increasingly specific. She wanted details about warehouses, commercial properties, partnership agreements, and asset reports. She paid close attention whenever conversations turned toward company value. Looking back now, I realized those discussions were never casual. They were research. And while I believed my wife was simply taking an interest in my work, she was quietly learning exactly what she might someday try to take from it. Slowly, the small details began connecting into something I could no longer ignore. At first, each incident seemed insignificant on its own. A phone call that ended the moment I entered the room. A conversation interrupted too quickly. A sudden interest in subjects that had never mattered to Megan before. I kept finding reasons to explain everything away. Marriage teaches you to give the benefit of the doubt. After enough years together, trust becomes automatic. You stop examining every inconsistency because you assume there must be a reasonable explanation. That assumption can be dangerous. The first thing that truly caught my attention was how often Megan asked about specific company assets. Not revenue, not profits, assets. She wanted to know the value of individual warehouses. She asked about ownership percentages. She even requested copies of reports she had never shown interest in before. At the same time, new people started appearing in her life. She mentioned friends whose names I had never heard before, networking groups, professional contacts, social events she attended alone. Whenever I asked questions, the answers were brief and vague. One afternoon, I came home unexpectedly between meetings. The house was quiet. As I walked past my home office, I noticed the door was partially open. Megan was standing beside my desk. Her phone was raised in front of her. For a second, she didn't realize I was there. Then she quickly lowered it. "Just looking for you," she said. I nodded and acted as though nothing had happened. But after she left the room, I checked the desk. Several financial documents had been moved. Nothing was missing. Nothing appeared damaged. Yet I knew exactly what I had seen. She had been taking photographs. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because of the documents themselves. Because it was the first time I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding for months. Maybe these weren't random incidents. Maybe they were connected. And if they were connected, then I wasn't looking at marital problems anymore. I was looking at a plan. If you've made it this far, this story clearly caught your attention. If you're enjoying it, drop a like on the video. It helps me see what kind of stories you want more of next. Let's keep going. The real turning point came long before I learned the full truth. It happened the day I stopped searching for innocent explanations. Until then, every strange event had been filtered through the same assumption. Megan was still the woman I married. No matter how unusual her behavior became, I kept trying to fit it into a version of reality that preserved that belief. Eventually, that became impossible. The photographs in my office stayed in my mind for weeks. Not because they proved anything on their own, but because they forced me to confront a simple question. Why would a wife secretly photograph financial documents? Every answer I came up with felt dishonest. I wasn't lying to anyone else. I was lying to myself. The moment I accepted that fact, something changed inside me. The anger I expected never arrived. Instead, I felt strangely calm, almost relieved. When uncertainty disappears, even unpleasant truths can feel easier to carry. A few days later, I scheduled a meeting with an attorney. I didn't tell Megan. I didn't tell friends. I didn't even tell my business partners. I simply drove to a small law office on the edge of downtown Kansas City and spent 3 hours discussing possibilities I never imagined I would need to consider. Divorce, asset protection, corporate ownership, trust structures, contingency planning. The attorney never once told me what he thought was happening. He didn't need to. He listened carefully and then helped me prepare for outcomes that might never come. When I left his office that afternoon, I wasn't carrying evidence. I wasn't carrying proof. I was carrying preparation. That distinction mattered. From that day forward, I stopped reacting and started observing. I no longer needed to convince myself that everything was fine. I no longer needed reassurance. Whatever was happening would eventually reveal itself. My responsibility wasn't to chase answers. It was to make sure I was ready when they arrived. And deep down, I could already feel them coming. Once I stopped making excuses, I started noticing things I had overlooked for months. The difference was subtle but important. I wasn't investigating Megan. I was observing reality. Every morning, I followed the same routine. I went to work, attended meetings, reviewed contracts, and managed operations across the company. On the surface, nothing had changed. Privately, however, I paid attention. Megan spent increasing amounts of time with people she described only as friends. The explanations were always vague. Networking events, professional gatherings, marketing contacts. Names appeared and disappeared without context. Meanwhile, changes inside my company began attracting my attention. One of my senior managers, Ryan Mitchell, suddenly became interested in subjects that fell well outside his responsibilities. He asked questions about future acquisitions, major contracts, and long-term client agreements. At first, I appreciated the initiative. Ryan had worked for me for years. He was competent, ambitious, and generally well-respected throughout the company. But his curiosity became unusually specific. He wanted projections, valuations, client retention figures, revenue forecasts, questions that made sense for an owner, not a manager. Again, none of it proved anything. Individually, every conversation could be explained. Together, they formed a pattern. I kept detailed notes, dates, meetings, comments, requests. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts. The more information I collected, the more detached I became from the situation. Instead of viewing events through the lens of trust or suspicion, I viewed them the same way I evaluated business risks. Objectively, methodically. One evening, while reviewing my notes, I noticed something interesting. Several of Megan's unexplained social events occurred on the same days Ryan remained unusually late at the office. Perhaps it was coincidence. Perhaps it wasn't. I resisted the temptation to jump to conclusions. Facts first, assumptions later. That approach had served me well in business for decades. Now it would serve me somewhere else. Because the puzzle was growing larger. And for the first time, the pieces were beginning to fit together. The situation stopped being a private marital issue the day the private investigator handed me a sealed envelope. I had hired him 2 months earlier, not because I wanted confirmation, but because I wanted facts. Emotions create noise. Facts create clarity. When I opened the envelope, the first photographs showed Megan and Ryan together. They weren't attending business meetings. They weren't networking. They weren't hiding particularly well, either. Restaurants, hotels, weekend trips they had both described differently to other people. I studied every image without feeling much of anything. By then, I had already accepted the likelihood of an affair. The photographs simply transformed probability into certainty. What surprised me was everything that came afterward. The investigator hadn't stopped with surveillance. He had followed financial leads, communication patterns, business contacts, and the information he uncovered changed the entire situation. According to his findings, Megan and Ryan weren't simply involved with each other. They were planning something much larger. Over several meetings, they had discussed launching their own transportation company after the divorce. They believed Ryan could attract several of my largest clients. Megan expected to fund the venture with a substantial divorce settlement. My divorce settlement. The report included timelines, business proposals, and records of conversations with potential investors. As I read through the material, the affair itself became almost secondary. Infidelity was painful. Business theft was dangerous. My company employed hundreds of people: drivers, dispatchers, warehouse supervisors, administrative staff. Families depended on those paychecks. The consequences of Megan and Ryan's plans extended far beyond my personal life. They were gambling with livelihoods that had nothing to do with their relationship. That realization settled something inside me. This was no longer a story about betrayal between spouses. It was a story about protecting people who trusted me. The company, the employees, the ranch, everything I had spent decades building. For the first time since the investigation began, I wasn't focused on what Megan had done. I was focused on what needed to be protected. And that changed every decision that followed. The only real conversation Megan and I had happened a few days before she filed for divorce. By then, I already knew far more than she realized. The investigation had been running for months. The attorney had completed most of the legal preparation. Corporate restructuring plans were already moving forward. Quietly, carefully, pieces were being positioned where they needed to be. Meanwhile, Megan believed she was still controlling the pace of events. That evening we were sitting on the back patio of our Kansas City home. The sun had nearly disappeared, leaving the yard covered in long shadows. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Then she broke the silence. "You've been quiet lately." I looked across the lawn before answering. "Have I?" She nodded. "You're different." The statement wasn't accusatory. It sounded more like concern, or perhaps curiosity. I considered several possible responses and settled on the simplest one. "I guess I'm starting to see things for what they are." The words hung between us. For a brief moment, I saw uncertainty cross her face. Not fear, not guilt, just uncertainty. "What does that mean?" she asked. I shrugged. "It means some things become clearer with time." She studied me carefully. I suspect she was searching for signs that I knew something. Maybe she wanted anger. Maybe she wanted confrontation. Perhaps she wanted reassurance that I remained unaware. Instead, she found nothing. The truth was that I no longer needed answers from her. I already had them. The conversation drifted into safer subjects after that. Work, travel plans, everyday topics that sounded increasingly artificial to my ears. Neither of us mentioned Ryan. Neither of us mentioned divorce. Neither of us mentioned the future. Yet somehow all three subjects sat quietly between us. When the discussion ended, Megan seemed unsettled. I think she sensed a shift she couldn't fully understand. The version of me she had relied upon for years was disappearing. Not through anger, not through revenge, through acceptance. And once acceptance arrives, Manipulation loses most of its power. By then, the outcome was already moving toward us. Neither of us could stop it. After that conversation, events began moving forward without much effort from me. Megan filed for divorce exactly 9 days later. The filing itself contained no surprises. Her attorneys requested the same things we had expected from the beginning. $8.5 million. 50% ownership of my logistics company. Full transfer of our family ranch. The numbers were ambitious. The ranch request was even more ambitious. Yet none of it concerned me. By that point, most of the important work had already been completed. Months earlier, under the guidance of my attorney and financial advisors, I had begun restructuring vulnerable assets. Every step was legal, documented, and completed long before any divorce filing existed. Ownership interests were transferred into a holding structure. Corporate governance was revised. Several business assets were repositioned according to recommendations that had nothing to do with divorce and everything to do with long-term protection. Most importantly, the ranch had been placed into a family trust designed to preserve ownership across generations. The trust wasn't new. It had simply been activated and strengthened at exactly the right time. Meanwhile, Ryan remained confident. The investigator continued providing updates, and those reports painted an increasingly interesting picture. Ryan and Megan were openly discussing their future business plans. They spoke about attracting my clients, recruiting employees, and launching operations shortly after the divorce concluded. Everything depended on one assumption. They believed the settlement was guaranteed. That belief influenced every decision they made. Office conversations became bolder. Planning became more detailed. Timelines became more aggressive. Neither of them realized they were building a business model on assets they would never control. I never interfered. I never issued threats. I never revealed what I knew. Instead, I allowed events to continue naturally. Sometimes people expose themselves more effectively when they believe no one is watching. As court dates approached, Megan appeared increasingly confident. Her attorneys projected certainty. Ryan spoke about opportunities that supposedly awaited him. They all seemed convinced the future belonged to them. What they didn't understand was that the foundation beneath those plans had already disappeared. They just hadn't noticed it yet. The atmosphere in the courtroom changed the moment the judge opened the folder. Until then, everything had unfolded exactly as Megan expected. Her attorneys presented their arguments with confidence. They spoke about marital assets, ownership interests, valuations, and entitlement. Every statement carried the assumption that the outcome was already decided. Across the room, Megan sat perfectly composed. Ryan wasn't present, but I knew he was waiting for updates. Both of them believed they understood the future. Then the judge opened the folder. The first documents were trust records. Not complicated, not dramatic. Just clear legal evidence showing the ranch had been placed into a protected family trust long before the divorce filing. The property wasn't available for division in the way Megan's attorneys had claimed. The judge continued reading. Next came the corporate restructuring records, ownership changes, governance amendments, holding company documentation. Every filing had been completed legally, transparently, and well before any court proceedings began. The confidence on Megan's face started fading. Then the judge reached the final section. Messages, emails, business proposals, communication records between Megan and Ryan. Evidence showing discussions about using confidential company information, pursuing existing clients, recruiting employees, and funding a competing transportation company with anticipated divorce proceeds. The courtroom grew noticeably quieter. Nobody whispered now. Nobody moved. The judge reviewed page after page while Megan's attorney slowly lost color. For the first time since the hearing began, uncertainty appeared throughout their side of the room. I felt none. No satisfaction. No triumph. No anger. Just calm. The truth had finally arrived where it belonged. Not hidden in reports. Not stored in legal offices. Not sitting inside investigation files. Right there in the courtroom. Visible. Documented. Impossible to explain away. I glanced toward Megan only once. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the folder. The same folder she never knew existed. And in that moment, I realized something important. The case had never been decided by what I said. It had been decided by what they chose to do. A few months later, I found myself sitting on the porch of the ranch again. The evening wind moved through the tall Nebraska grass exactly the way it had when I was a boy. The cottonwood trees swayed along the creek bed, and somewhere in the distance cattle drifted across the pasture. For the first time in a long while, everything felt quiet. The company was still operating. Drivers were still making deliveries. Employees were still collecting paychecks. The ranch was still where it had always been. Life had continued. People occasionally asked whether I felt like I had won. I never knew how to answer that question. Winning implies a competition. What happened wasn't a competition. It was a realization. At some point, Megan and Ryan had started building a future that didn't include me. They simply assumed I would help finance it. They were wrong. I didn't defeat them. I protected what mattered. The business, the ranch, the people who depended on both. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, I leaned back in my chair and listened to the familiar sounds of the property settling into evening. The truth was simple. I hadn't won. I hadn't lost. I had simply stopped building a future with people who had already been building one without me.
That's the end of the story. If you made it all the way here, consider subscribing to stay with us. I've placed a couple of recommended videos for you, so pick one and keep watching. I'll see you in the next story.